this. First reason is that children did not consent to be born in the first place. Therefore, these kind of children should be given the right basis of their life, for example, in terms of finance and so on. Second reason here is that children have less capacity to be able to protect themselves and also voice out their own opinions. This simply because they cannot go to like the government and go voting. And for example, for unborn children, they don't have any kind of organizations that will protect them beforehand of being born to this world. Therefore, they have less capacity to be able to protect themselves. But third reason is that the things that things that are necessary for children, no thank you, the things that are necessary for children to be able to be happy is very similar for many children. For example, food, clothes, water, and so on. Therefore, government has the right to be able to make some kind of standard for all these children equally. Then on to second point about the quality of parenting. The thesis of this argument is that the quality of parenting will go up on our side, but on their side of the house, they will have irrational parents. 3 layers under this. First layer as to why parents irrationally give birth to children on their side of the house. 4 structural reasons. A, child raising is a very long-term problem. This is equal for all of the parents. Therefore, it is very difficult to imagine the hard work in the first place. Even though many parents experience life as a child, it is very difficult for them to see all of the work of their own parents. They will only see them maybe standing on the kitchen. However, they will not be able to know how much work they put in the kitchen or to learn how to cook and so on. And furthermore, because these kind of things are very long lasting for 18 years, these kind of things are really difficult to imagine in the first place. But B, some people simply enjoy sexual interaction because of personal interest, and therefore they don't really care about the results, for example, giving birth to child accidentally and so on. But C, in developing world context, they think that children are their own possession, therefore they will be able to use those kind of things for child labor and so on. Therefore, in these kind of cases, there are irrational parents. But D, even some parents were born in the poverty area or maybe the child abuse area. Therefore, for those kind of parents, they don't think those kind of things are a problem to do to their own children in the first place. Therefore, the implication here is that there are a lot of irrational parents that don't think about the child's happiness a lot on their side of the house. Then, second layer under this is as to why this leads to unhappy children a lot. 2 reasons why. A, there's less financial capacity for these kind of parents to be able to give a lot of happiness to these kind of children. This looks like, for example, the parents not being able to provide them the basic education for these kind of children, or not being able to put food on the table for these kind of children to be able to, for example, overcome of their developing period, or maybe not a lot of clothes. Especially in the capitalist society right now, there are a lot of things that we need money to be able to buy, even for these kind of basic goods that many people think that are really essential for their own lives. Therefore, for these kind of things, if these kind of children don't have a lot of parents that have financial capacity to be able to support them, it is a very crucial problem, because they will otherwise see other children maybe having a lot of things but they don't really have, which is really bad for their mental, but also really bad for your own physical health in the first place. But B, maybe these kind of children will lead to lack of love, since some parents, even we can see in the current situation, they sometimes see child abuse. No, thank you. They sometimes see child abuse. Therefore, we can see that some parents have different kind of point of views and also different kind of love towards their own children, and maybe no love at all. These kind of things are like may lead to things like not taking a lot of time for your own children, or maybe in the worst case, child abusement. Therefore, this is likely to lead to unhappy children. Then, third layer under this is as to why children will become happier on our side of the house. We want to know here that on our side of the house exclusively, you will be able to increase the number of rational parents in the first place. This is because on our side of the house, because these kind of laws will be implemented, and furthermore will be normalized for many people, they're likely to learn these kind of laws in their own education and think that, first of all, children are not your own possession, and therefore you have to fulfill some kind of condition to be able to have the freedom to have children in the first place. Therefore, less people maybe unlikely to lead to, for example, just sexual interaction with because of your own interest, or maybe you're likely to think about your own future in the long term before having this kind of children. The true reasons why children will be happier on our side. Simply, parents will be able to have sustainable financial capacity. Therefore, they have more capacity to be able to provide food, education, clothes, water, and so on, and all these kind of essences for their own children. I want to know here that on our side of the house, it is not our goal to make a lot of rich children, but rather children who will be able to have a sustainable life in the basic level. But B, these kind of children will be able to have more love in their side of the house. This is because these kind of parents have be able to pass this kind of emotional and mental capacity kind of tests or documents, they'll be able to have the common sense as to how they should be able to treat children, treat babies, and so on. Furthermore, for babies, it is very important to be in touch with their mothers for like maybe 24/7 because they are still young and still vulnerable mentally. The impact here is that children's stability and happiness will go up on our side of the house. These kind of children are the most vulnerable ones, like I said in my principal argument. Therefore, we should be able to protect them and also make their faces happier and maybe smile a lot and so on. Therefore, very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. Now the floor goes to the five-star position speaker.
Okay, yep, sure. Just give me a second. Organizing the speech. Sure. Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Making children on proposition side happy was thinly veiled excuse to rob the most vulnerable of their rights to self-determined autonomy while allowing the further fragmentation of social equality. On all, we say this is unjust and to rob people of their righteous expression. First of all, this is how my speech is going to go. I'm going to go first in going some basic rebuttals, then I'll go into some framing which side government lacked, and then I'm going to my arguments. So first of all, on rebuttals, let's broadly take down the point about children being vulnerable and healthy. None of the analysis is about how the child being vulnerable matters if they don't fulfill the obligation of helping these children in the first place. Like, yeah, if they can't vote, they also can't vote on both sides of the house. We say yes, that this state does, but the children are better served on our side because number one, we have welfare that provides for these kids. Number two, we don't make the life of minority parents harder. Secondly, about poor parents not being able to take care of their own children. I'm going to broadly go over this then because it extends on to my argument. Understand that it doesn't mean that poor parents are automatically bad parents. It also could be good as well. In long of these poor areas where they put in extra hours into jobs, whatnot, they make sacrifices within their own personal lives in order to provide for these children, which then Gov needs to further push the analysis or analyze on why the incentive still stands. Now, based on to some basic setup. Number one, why is first form they are set up? This system is massive bureaucratic and a financial liability. You have people take this test for everything. Side government doesn't explain how is this test going to conduct, how are they going to go forth from this test, and why is it and how are they going to get these public social workers to run these programs? B, as such, we need to posit that policies have does very marginal good, then it's gigantuan cost because highly amount of time this is only allowed towards the higher majority or very exclusive to those who are comfortable within their lives. And see, things happen to people by utilizing so much of their resources. You prevent these individuals within this world to have these public services. Number one, for example, postpartum depression, where even if they pass these tests, then it will later affect how this child is going to be raised and the factors that PsyGov has to do with in order for their model to function. Secondly, of setup. Opposition's counterfactual is status quo. Child's protective services and whatnot. On either side of the house, there's a strong de-incentivision for bad parents to have children. Number one, social stigma against bad parenting. You're seen as the devil having failed your child, and this seen as universally taboo in all cultures. Number two, legal punishments. Negligence, abuse still exists on our side. And number three, financial and emotional cost of having a child deters many bad parents who are not committed. Secondly, On our position, our counterfactual is that we can use opposition fiat to allocate resources into family support programs. This looks like number one, for the enhancing child protective services, and number two, better welfare programs for families struggling financially. What is the ops burden within this debate? The ops burden is to prove why issuing parenting permits fundamentally robs individuals of their instinctual right at a base level, but also manifests as further harms to the wider society. What is the burden pusher? What does opposition need to do? Number one, they need to tell us why is it okay for the state to determine their ability to have children of predicted factors that have long proven to be incorrect. And even if they do, number two, they need to prove why is it necessary for resources to sink in the first place? Why acts adopt pre-existing measures, and why have structurally locked out minorities in the first all in this process. Now, onto our argument. There's three layers of analysis to this argument. First layer, issuing parenting permit acts as a preemptive signal by the state that their moral authority is able to be imposed by negatives as happens. What does this look like? A, on ops side, governments take action against parents that have proved that they failed their parenting duties via child protective services, via welfare programs. This means that it's reactive and proportionate to how much they need to protect the child. B, what is the parallel crime is committed? You aren't thrown into jail for being a background of high crime rates or family where your family members, but you're already committed the crimes. This is inherently important as to avoid over-policing. And C, this specific context, your past isn't directly translation, but it becomes an invisible barrier actually being a parent. This deals with gov's push on how that you being in a highly crime rate area is going to lead to a child being abused, whatnot, and this sort of things, right? Second layer is empowered the state to utilize these narratives to violate the rights of other policing methods. This looks like A, accepting to overgeneralization, preemptive factors in policy making. Over policy making minority neighborhoods because they're more likely to commit crimes and do sort of things. And B, propelling societal narratives that oppress that are already worst off in society. Native Americans are seen as uneducated because they can't get any parental permits, leaks into society via these individuals and the views. And third layer, importance of allowing the autonomy of aspiring parents. This looks like A, having a kid seen on a personal level like religion, seeing a kid as a nature of your own is a personal dream or interest of a person, right? Secondly, B, what person perceives as good quality of life, maybe a bad quality of... Wait, I'll take that POI soon. Quality of life is highly subjective. It is not fair for a rich man within these majoritarian states to put a bar onto what these raising kids might be like, because even then, there's still parents within these small minority states or whatnot that are willing to put in the effort and have some incentive within the background to go forward for this. The conclusion to this argument is that the principal injustice of the state, on opposition, we prove that the state should only intervene after guaranteed harm that has been demonstrated. That state should not be excessively intervened. I'll take that POI now.
Why is having children for such kind of parents are that important for them?
We have explained to you in our case. Towards these individuals, these minorities might see it as like their fundamental reasoning. For example, religion backboning, there is like being told from young that, oh yeah, when you grow up, you want to have a kid. These are interests of people and we cannot rob them of these sort of rights, right? Second argument, minorities are locked away from having children. The premise of this argument is that the minorities communities are less likely to have any children when parenting permits are put into place. Why is there a threshold or criteria created by the state and is more likely inherently discriminatory? Number one, people are in charge of these parenting permits are majoritarian. A, this is because majoritarian individuals have the most resources to enter position of power. Number one, this looks like psychologists and researchers who end up deciding the criteria and usually are from more privileged backgrounds and were able to attend the top university to get this qualification. Number two, politicians usually collect data from whether majoritarian areas, e.g. closer to the city at the expense of those in rural areas, because catering to those of other majority groups is more strategic to them getting more votes. Number two, secondly, these people are less likely to be related to the nuance of minorities. For example, a lot of Western psychology say that tiger parenting is immoral, but many of them have flawed view of tiger parenting due to media portrayal. Not all tiger parenting is about hitting them and denying them of happiness. In reality, tiger parenting is showing up for them to their future of success and support values of fidelity. B, a lot of cultures and traditions are viewed as unproductive or irrational. For example, teaching them religion is seen as indoctrinating children. In reality, teaching them the way of God is the key life to religion obligation as a parent. And see, this leads to the majority of the time minorities are being overlooked and going to be flagged for being bad parents because of the way they are live up to the standards of majority. Number one, our case currently has clashed a lot with what Gov has proposed. If Gov doesn't deal with our case, the model falls and it cannot stand within this debate. And third layer of analysis is this impacts The effects of this is because majorities cannot appreciate the uniqueness of minority cultures. Minorities are far less likely to get parental permits. A. Minorities are less likely to get represented where the majoritarian holds a huge position of power and influence in charge permits if like understanding empathy towards these minorities, where it leads to more biased decisions and to the basis of the context of not being rich enough. What have I given you in my speech? Number one, I've given a layer analysis explaining to why is it an incentive for these individuals or incentive of the government to principally adhere to not lock out individuals from enjoying the excess joy of the family, and to explain to why minorities should not have to be locked away from having children and why do they fulfill their responsibilities. With that, side with side opposition. Thanks.
Thank you for that speech. Now the second speaker from the proposition.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you are audible.
My name is Mikuri Noda from Nanzan A. My pronouns is she and her, and I'll take POI verbally, not in chat. We believe working as a parent is very hard and over expectations, and they have to sacrifice themselves and invest for children. And therefore, we will provide the opportunity to make the big decision for adult and for stability of rising children. Therefore, we proudly propose. I'm gonna talk about two things in my speech. First, parents, and second, children. First, about children. Under this theme, two things. First, incentive, and second, capacity. First, about incentive. They talk about social obligation of raising children. However, we don't think so for for two reasons. Firstly, we think that those parents are likely to be rational because raising children is very hard over expectation, as our first speaker told you. And also on their side, a house, they are likely to prioritize their own working or enjoyment because they will not be able to do their favorite things that they always do. For example, that if the parents like to play the game, however, after making their children, they have to change diaper and so on, and therefore they will lose time to relax themselves, and therefore they will get they are likely to get stressed, and this means that they are likely to that child abuse or child labor are likely to happen, we think. And also on their side house, some people don't have incentive to love children in the first place because we cannot ensure that whether the parents have love or not. And two things. Firstly, the case of people who mistake to make children. No, thank you. And secondly, in especially developing country, that some parents are likely to make children to decrease their own burden. Like we want to earn much more money to live comfortably, and therefore, like they make the lots of human resources as child, and they use their children illegally. We think it is very serious problem. And secondly, about the capacity, they said about those minority or like criminal is very it's very serious. For those people, it is very unjust. However, it is not true because we think those like criminal is very difficult to be employed, and therefore those children are likely to be suffered after some years ago, and because they cannot get the stable life and stable quality of life. And like, for example, yes.
Your Prime Minister says that one of the key reasons being a parent, you're going to be an irrational parent, is because people have sexual interactions. On both sides of the house, people are going to have sex. What happens to the children that are accidentally conceived on your side of the house?
We think those like people who mistake to make children is like they don't understand how important and how serious those how big those, like, if those rising children is, and also they are uneducated to raise their children, and therefore they just enjoy them like making children, and we think it is very serious problem. And also because those minority cannot provide enough stable quality of life, it is very serious. And those, even if they can love the children, they cannot provide enough food and like opportunity to go to school and like those visible results. And therefore we think it is very detrimental. And then even if they have strong incentive to love, we think that capacity is more important than love. This is because they have to spend the stable lives, and they cannot afford to feed family. And we think that those capacity, the financial or emotional capacity, is one of the important way to express love. Express love. And second, about the children, we think children should be protected. Should be protected from child abuse or child labor for two reasons. Firstly, children is smaller than adult, and in fact, therefore they cannot resist to the adult and parents. Therefore, they are likely to be injured, and in worst case, they will die because of the child labor or child abuse. And secondly, because of the birth lottery problem, they cannot decide where they can born or not. And also, like, they don't have right to decide who should be their parent, and so on. Therefore, we think that those children is incredibly vulnerable. What if that parent parents make the children unconsciously? And finally, weighing that which is important, children's happiness or adult or parent freedom. We think that children's happiness is the most important things because they are incredibly vulnerable, and they, as I said, they have no right to decide the born or burn, and therefore that those parents should have the strong sense of responsibility on these big chances and big options. Therefore, we're very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. Now the floor goes to the second opposition speaker.
Hi, am I audible? Okay, thank you. I'll take POIs verbally, she, her pronouns. Okay. Starting. This debate should have never been pigeoned into whether the clash was children's happiness against parents' happiness. Fundamentally, on opposition, we think this was an incorrect metric to judge this debate. Proposition's case, therefore, should have never relied on the entire premise that children's happiness was important, because it's undeniable and extremely intuitive that children's happiness was important in the very first place. They needed to give us mechanistic analysis as to how they were actually able to change this on their side of the house. At the top of this second speech then, I would first like to call out that the proposition case relies on one sole premise, that the state owes a responsibility to protect the children. And while this may be true and is undeniable, there's two key things that I want to therefore point out on the proposition case as to how they never actually prove why children will actually be happier on their side of the house. The first is that the self-imposed burden on proposition was extremely ideal, and we got no mechanistic analysis as to how they were able to prove their burden then. They say that children are going to be happy on their side of the house because on our side, supposedly every single children that is unhappy in these situations, and the children that were likely able to be deterred away from these situations were one that never had enough food on the table, were ones that could never afford the basic living necessities. Firstly, I would like to first mitigate this because we don't think that in a lot of these situations that these parents likely had the time or rather to actually decide to have these children in the very first place. We think it was extremely uncharitable to simply point out that every single parent and every single individual thus far on earth, due to their sexual urges, is just going to be irrational and therefore just want to reproduce as a result. We think this was not likely the larger case as a scenario. But secondly, I want to deal with their first argument because it's simply just proving that children have lesser capacity than parents and therefore the state should protect them. They say children are born into financially incapable families and therefore they lack having the main sources to being happy. We think on status quo, there's two fronts, and status quo and the opposition case then, there's two fronts as to how we deal with this. The first is that you are able to these individuals likely still have child protective services. You're still able to access social welfare programs. So even if proposition likes to push the worst case scenario for us, where individuals are living in destitute, where they're living in these slums, we think that individuals are still able to access, in the worst case, social welfare programs that likely they aren't going to get as many resources allocated to them on the proposition case. Because assuming the best case for proposition, where they want to make their entire system and their policy of issuing parenting permits as flawless as possible, they have to push in a lot of resources towards this entire policy, therefore diverting resources away from other policies, such as the pre-existing social welfare
Point
program.
of
They
information.
cannot say, no thank you, is that they are able to actually allocate resources equally to all of these things because we simply don't think that political capital allowed for governments to diverse their resources in such a manner anyways. So there's absolutely no mechanistic analysis besides how most parents are going to be irrational on their side of the house. The second layer then, the second point of call then, is how unclear the mechanism is. And I would like to question them. What exactly is the financial threshold that are able to be issued a parenting permit on their side of the house? Because the setup we got from first proposition was that it is going to be according to each country, assuming their best case then that you are able to get, for example, the most average middle class individual. We think in a volatile society, you would likely to not necessarily be stuck in the middle, or likely if you want to keep your parenting permit, if you want to keep your children on their side of the house and want to have a family, you are going to be struggling with working. And therefore, all of their harms on parents overworking, not giving their child enough time on their side of the house was going to be flipped onto their own case. They couldn't run this analysis either way. We think parents are going to be far worse on their side of the house then. Moving on into two issues that will win us this debate before a last extension. The first on the quality of parenting. And the importance of opposition winning this debate is very simple because we proved that the quality of parenting was unlikely to improve on their side of the house. Insofar as they took up such a large burden of wanting to actually change and make all children happy, we think it was unlikely in the very first place. I want to make this clear at the top of this clash then, is that the worst case for child neglect, for example, a second proposition likes to push that is going to be death, we think in the worst cases, people on their side of the house are likely going to have this as well in the worst case scenario. Simply, you couldn't play on the most radical ends because we think that the tests they employ aren't going to be something that is going to be as holistic as they try to frame it to be. They aren't going to be able to predict the likely future as a result. But even if they was able to predict the future and have such data on these individuals, our first argument from first opposition therefore stands. We are likely to over-police individuals. We are likely to preemptively decide what an individual's outcome is going to be. All of the principal harms therefore still stand in this debate as a principal extrapolation. The first point I want to rebut under this issue then is the proposition case is extremely discriminatory to the most destitute individuals in society, that every single one of these individuals was inherently irrational and never could actually have the capacity to uplift themselves. We think for a lot of individuals, and the individuals that they never characterized as actually they were unable to get these parenting permits on their side of the house, could actually have the capacity to have a child. And therefore, there was no right for proposition to rob them of having a child as a result. They couldn't push the worst harms. But even if they did push the worst harms, we still had social welfare programs. It was unjustified why you had to preemptively solve all these problems on their side of the house. The second point then is that they are irrational due to sexual urges. We think this was simply symmetrical on both sides of the houses. If you're irrational to have sexual urges, we think accidental pregnancies still are likely to happen on their side of the house as well. So they had to deal with this issue. Suddenly then on parents being irresponsible, coming from second proposition as an extension, parents are going to be irresponsible because of their daily interests. For example, we think that this was going to be symmetrical. If they wanted to assess this, we think a lot of parents are therefore not going to be wanting to become parents anymore, because individuals can never be deterred away from their own individual interests. As a result, we think parents can simultaneously have their own interests on our side of the house. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
Don't you think that your social welfare policy is much unrealistic, since it costs a lot of money, food, clothes, and so on, rather testing is rather more sustainable?
One, I think this was completely untrue. Testing had to get preemptive data from every single individual. You had to go through this long bureaucratic process in order to assume proposition's best case scenario. Social welfare programs exist in the status quo, and they're not as resource intensive. If they wanted to trade off social welfare programs on their side of the house, then we think this was a failure for their case, because the existing children on their side of the house could never actually be supported then. The second clash then is in terms of aspiring minority parents and minority communities in general. I'm going to spend less time on this because it was never actually engaged with by the second proposition, and was as an argument coming out from first opposition that they needed to deal with. Number one, that they were able to further propagate majoritarian culture where minorities were inherently locked out. For example, if you're an Asian parent that wanted a tiger parent, you're going to be far worse off in terms of obtaining this parenting permit, because the government never assessed you as going to be qualified. But secondly, this again allows for over-policing of minority communities as a result. Before I end this speech, there's a last extension I want to quickly make. And this argument is debate winning here on why proposition's policy robbed the catalyst for stability in society. There's two key layers of analysis to this argument. The first is that by bringing a constraint on national resources, the diversification of resources away from social welfare programs and child protective services that were intrinsic to society was damaging for the entirety of society. The second layer towards this then is why was it crucial within this debate to care about the children that currently exist already. And assuming proposition's best case, where they want to make the best policies possible, we think that resources are going to be robbed away from child protective services, and therefore the children that the parents were able to change in terms of their mentality at the end of obtaining this parenting permit were never going to actually be protected on their side of the house. On three main metrics then, we win this debate, and there's three reasons to vote for the opposition.
Thank you for that speech. Now the floor goes to the third speaker from the proposition team.
Am I audible?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. I'm the web speaker from proposition side, and I would like she, her pronouns and POIs verbally. I will not be seeing chat. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two questions in my speech. Firstly, how this policy is going to work, and secondly, which is better for children. Then firstly, how is this policy going to work? We will prove why government has enough capacity and incentive to judge what kind of parents are likely to be best for their children. This is likely because governments can judge, but firstly by collecting a lot of data and using AI to analyze what kind of parenting is likely to be less burden for children. This is likely to governments are likely to be able to have capacity to do those things, because as for government, they can recruit and like professional people so that they can understand how is children's mental going to like and what kind of thing that children is needing. This is likely to be far more sustainable than things like social welfare, because in case of social welfare, if there are like too many poor people and too many people who need social welfare in that country, it isn't likely to be able to work. On the other hand, if governments creates this kind of testing and permission once, it can sustain for long years and even in the future too. And even if governments cannot like judge those things like mental things and so on, they can purely judge by the income of parents. And this is very important because poor parents aren't likely to be able to raise children as well as parents who has income. This is so likely that children who are raised in poor families are likely to be unlikely to be happy than other families. This is because if parents are poor, firstly, they won't be able to like have time with their children because those poor parents are likely to have like a blue collar job which pays very low, which means that they have to work for long hours in order to feed their family. This means that those poor parents aren't likely to have enough time with their child to like have mental connection with that child and so on. And also they are likely to be able to provide enough education and enough information for children that they need in the future. So those poor parents aren't likely to have capacity to raise their child, and children in those poor families are unlikely to be happy compared to other households. So even if governments cannot do those kind of like data thing, they can purely judge by income, and this is very persuasive for many things. Then they talked about like how some parents are blocked out of this choice of having a child because of this permission test. However, we say that parents can always improve, for example, like their financial situation and so on. So it is not true that some kind of parents are, yes.
How will parents on your side of the house improve their financial situation in this economy then?
Well, this is because, like, for example, if parents are like very young, too young, for example, like 18, and they want to have a child, they cannot do so because they've only started working and they don't have enough financial capacity to raise their child. However, once their parents are older, like they are 25 and 26, and they have like made their careers to the point where they can earn enough income in order to like raise their child, they will be able to have those kind of child. So because of this permission kind of test, parents can have like a chance to be rational and to like consider if they can really have a child and so on. Then they also talked about like not being able to prevent like prevent a future problems and so on. However, this is so unlikely because firstly, when those kind of parents pass the test, those future problems to those households is unlikely. This is because of two reasons. Firstly, if parents are once judged that they don't have like emotional problems to raise their child, their opinion about child doesn't change so frequently. For example, if there is some kind of parents who thinks that raising their child is their first priority, their priority won't change so easy. So even if they have like a mental problems in the future, they are at least likely to think that their children are very important. So by this test, the future problems can be prevented. And also, even if like some kind of parents have the mental problems in the future and those tests could not prevent it, it is okay because at least we can save like the worst case where we can save the worst case where parents have like these kind of bias that children is not important and they can make their children work for them and so on. So because we can prevent those worst case of neglecting and like child labor and so on, our side is much better. Then our second clash about on which side it is better for children. They talked about having social welfare on both sides of the world. However, this is likely to be symmetric on both sides of the world. No thank you. This is likely to be symmetric on both sides of the world, which makes on the proposition side much better because we can block out those like biased and those radical parents in the first place. And also, even if those tests could not predict like a future problems, they can go to like a social welfare to get work. On our side, we have both tests and social welfare, which makes our side much better. Then, even if it wasn't symmetric, I will explain why social welfare isn't likely to work on their side of the world. This is because, firstly, those parents who aren't like some parents actually don't even know about the social welfare. No, thank you. This is because those parents who grew up in like those harsh and like abuseful conditions don't actually have information of how to get social welfare and how to seek help for the government. And secondly, for parents who actually grew up in the same condition, like grew up in poor families and grew up in like minority conditions, those parents don't think that their children is having the problem in the first place. For example, even if like some parents is neglecting their child, the parents don't know that this is a neglect because the parents themselves grew up in the same condition too. So on our side of the world, on their side of the world, social welfare is unlikely to work in the worst case of families that we are trying to prevent. So on our side, we can prevent like the worst case of families where parents don't have a bias and parents have like a radical thought of like making their children work and so on. Then they also talked about like minority families being blocked out. However, we still think that this is justifiable because if they are like a minority families, they might have like a different thought that their children can like be in a religion without their consent and so on. And on our side, we can still prevent the most radical case where parents are thinking that they can abuse their child and so on. So on our side, it is much better because firstly, parents are still likely to think that their children is important on our side of the world, and also they can have like a least income that they need in order to raise their child. For all those reasons, propose.
Thank you for the speech. Now the floor goes to the opposition third speaker.
Sorry, give me a second to set up my notes. I think in the 24 minutes of prop speeches so far, we are yet to hear an actual mechanism as to how they genuinely created change for the people that they wanted to talk about. They have all of their metrics about how they ensured the happiness of the children. We are yet to see any sort of mechanism as to how they actually get that, as to how the lives of children are benefited on their side, and through the consistent lack of engagement with my previous two speakers, I think they lost this debate from the very get-go. I'm going to talk about two issues within my speech today. Firstly, on the quality of life for the child and the parent as a whole. And secondly, then, on the principle level that they failed to engage with. First, on the quality of life for this child. No, this clash was debate winning for the side of opposition because it was the backbone of proposition case. That if we prove that, in fact, the life of this child isn't going to be as bad as they claim it is, I think we took this debate. Two sub-clashes under this. Firstly, does the state actually owe an obligation to these children in the first place? Because we don't disagree. We say, yes, the state owes this obligation to the child. But two reasons why they can't push this harm onto us. Because note, firstly, On our side of the house, children are better served because on their side, what you're forced to do is divest from things like welfare. That this policy is like to be a massive economic sink, the point at which you had to force every single person in your nation to take this test. What this meant was they had to take the trade-off. They had to say that things like social welfare and child protective services were going to be the victims of this policy on their side of the house. It meant these children were unable to access long-term facilities that ensured their safety and protection. But secondly, that on their side of the house, they made the lives of minority parents harder. That as much as they want to tell you that people are going to be rational parents on their side, there's still going to be those sexual interactions they seem so hyper-focused on. That on both sides of the house, people in developed nations have a lack of access to family planning, which means you're not going to be able to predict whether you have children or not. The question then was on which side made it easier for these minority parents to access things like social welfare, and that coin strictly fell on the side of opposition. But I want to take down the three structural reasons they actually provide to you as to why parents are going to be irrational, prove to you why those are incorrect. Firstly, that parents do not understand the cost of parenting. 3 responses here. Firstly, that this is simply untrue on a logical level. That as a parent, you're likely to consider what this child is going to bring you because the costs that are incurred are going to be extremely high. I don't think they can assert that just because you want a child so much, you're not going to think about how much it's going to cost you. Secondly, that this was non-mutually exclusive with or without this policy. Because on their side of the house, being rich and being mentally stable does not mean that you are able to deal with the volatility of life. That you have things like postpartum depression that we POI'd from first speaker that they literally consider they are unable to deal with. These were the terrible lives that children still had to lead on their side of the house. But thirdly, that even if we buy their analysis that parents are going to be blindsided, this doesn't mean you're going to all of a sudden abandon their love for your child. Because no, even in developing countries, children are seen as an extension of yourself. You're going to put yourself in an active loss to ensure these children are living better lives. That I'm going to sacrifice some of my working time to ensure that I can spend time with my son. These are the things that parents, even in developing countries, are likely to do because of the fact they know they owe an obligation to this child to provide them a better life. They couldn't just claim you completely ignored them. But secondly, on this whole
Point of
idea
information.
of interactions, I'll take that later. But I think people are going to have sex on either side of the house because as they claim, it's something that you want to do as like a reproductive being. But note that this was not something that changed. That their side of the house, developed nations still had a lot of children as a byproduct of not having family planning. Now, how do you actually weigh this out? Because I would argue on our comparative, what you're able to do is expend the money that you are willing to spend on this policy to do things like fund educational campaigns that already exist in the status quo. You're able to do things like increase access to contraceptives, which when these incidents were much less likely to be common. But thirdly, they tell you that children are going to be born to situations of poverty or abuse. Note that this was borderline elitist, right? Because the analysis here is that they'll see children as human capital. 2 responses. Firstly, that quality of life was subjective in the first place. That is to say, parents were incentivized from the very start to take care of their children. But beyond that, it was not the duty of the rich person to decry the life of someone that's much poorer than them. Because the life through the lens of someone that's in a more economically disadvantaged state means you're going to derive happiness from other sources that maybe aren't as materialistic. That even though I live in a poor village in Africa, I can still be happy whenever my parents come home because I can talk to them, I can spend time with them. Happiness wasn't something they got from the very get-go. But beyond that, I really doubt that children are going to be seen as free child labor, given that they need more resources. If parents were as heartless as they wanted to say, I don't think children would be the way to go here. But I'm going to weigh this out, right? Because I think on the very worst case, this issue was a wash. Because how do we break the deadlock here? I think we won on 3 metrics. Firstly, the clear lack of mechanism we see coming from the side of proposition as not anything actually happens. Because what was uniquely damning to their case was the concession that PM made in the POI answer. They are willing to give up children who have children whose mothers have postpartum depression because they're unable to predict that. That was exactly what was wrong with the predictive metrics we told you in these previous 2 speeches, because what it meant was the children that are going to be born are still going to be privy to having bad parents or irrational parents just as a byproduct of life existing. What this meant was, on their side, you're still unable to ensure the quality of these parents, given that they failed to mechanize to us when and how these tests are going to be taken. But second, what did we actually tell you to flip this, right? I think we told you that on their side of the house, because they failed to deal with our comparative. Our side, what we posited to you was that on our side, you're able to do things like use the op fiat to do things like information campaigns. They're able to use create things like parent blogs and state-structured facilities to allow these people to access better lives, to access social welfare. The only thing we hear in response to this is that parents don't know that their children are being abused, and this is exactly the problem that arises on their side of the house. Because note, on the side of opposition, this was fundamentally untrue and didn't exist. Because our side was able to put funding into things like child protective services, that the government was able to spot out when things were going wrong and were able to deal with it in a more equitable way. That was what we were able to defend. Before that, I'll take a PY, I guess.
Why do, if parents feel the obligation, they will always be able to put it into action if they have some kind of financial difficulties?
Right, know that even if you do have financial difficulties, I'm not going to completely abandon my child because of it. That I'm going to see this child as an extension of myself. I want to give them a better life than what I had just because of my biological connection to them. It is unrealistic for you to assume I will just ditch them. I think the final nail in the coffin here was Alicia's speech, because what she tells you is that on their side of the house, what you're likely to see is a fundamental divestment from important protective services. What is meant is, on their side of the house, they're unable to access any facilities. And I want to talk about the second thing here, which is that they that our principal level was unresponded to from prop. Because they couldn't just say, oh, but children's happiness is the most important thing. That was uncontentious from the very beginning. We agreed on this metric. Because Jayden sends you 4 minutes telling you why this policy was principally abhorrent in the first place. It was a fundamental injustice of the state when this policy was created. And the majority of the time when minorities were going to be overlooked and displayed as bad parents because they didn't live to majoritarian standards. The tiger parenting, in fact, sets you up for future success, but Western societies are never going to be able to accept that. So the world that they had to live in, and they didn't contest this in any 3 of their speeches. Panel, from the sheer lack of engagement itself, I think it's clear that you side with opposition. Thank you.
So thank you for that speech. Now the reply speaker from opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. It was the elitist perspective propositions stood on within this debate that led to the downfall of the entirety of their case. From the start, the first thing they did was concede to the principal harm of their case, that you are able to over-police individuals, that you preemptively categorize that some individuals are going to be damned and could never actually obtain this parenting permit, that they therefore force people into a cycle of actually trying to obtain this parenting permit if they were such aspiring parents. But sadly, for a lot of individuals, their own individual characteristics, such as what ethnicity they came from, could be something that could never change within this for an individual. But secondly, that they also threw minorities out of the entirety of their debates, with the only response coming from third proposition being that it's unrightful for these individuals to push their children into religions they never consented to. We think this was uncontentious to begin with, for the main reason that likely this also happens for a majoritarian population, so that never actually dealt with the entirety of our argument. Second proposition never dealt with this argument, and therefore, at the end of this debate, our second argument was untouched within the entirety of the debate. The first clarification I would like to make is who will actually have children in the very first place. They cannot say that all individuals on our side of the house are going to be irrational, and suddenly everyone is going to be rationally working towards becoming a better parent on their side of the house. This was inherently neglectful to the actual situation parents face in the status quo, where likely parents can be overworked, but at the end of the day, they still love their children and want to treat their children well. That some parents can simply just be of accidental pregnancies, and likely, due to their own mechanism as to why parents are irrational, that likely their sexual urges can still lead to accidental pregnancies. They also never dealt with what about mental issues after you have obtained the parenting permit, for example with postpartum depression, insofar as they deterred away policies and deterred away funding from these parents that already existed and already have become parents. We think it was damning for the entirety of their case. The second was what was opposition actually supporting, and why was this exclusive? The first thing, and coming out from first opposition already, was that there are likely going to be better campaigns on how to become a better parent. They had to prove why exclusively they were able to solve all of these problems, that the rest of our mechanisms were unfeasible in the first place. Child protective services still exist, so top proposition cannot just come up here and say that parents don't know how to access social welfare programs. Likely, if they were so bad, child protective services are likely going to take their child away from those abusive parents in the first place. The third thing here is in terms of a faulty, inherently discriminatory proposition policy. Because they say financially, they were unclear as to how actually what the threshold they had to meet in this debate. They cannot just lock it to the most wealthy elites. We think this just left the poor to die out. But secondly, it was that the mental and psychological aspects were just unpredictable from the very get-go. For example, with the postpartum example. Then three main issues then. The first in some of pre-existing children. And I think we immediately win this off when first proposition decides to just trade off social welfare programs because they were never going to be helpful. They were able to trade off child protective services on their side of the house. The pre-existing children on outside of the house needed these services if they were ever to face an abusive circumstance. This wasn't a retrospective debate. Proposition did not have that fiat from the very get-go. But secondly is in terms of minorities. And I think it's morally abhorrent for them to trade off minority ethnicities and religions because these were the individuals that are most oppressed in today's society already. But the third metric then is in terms of neglectful parents, if they want to hinge the entirety of the case on this. And we go by the first proposition set up in this debate that they wanted to meet the three thresholds of financially and mentally and emotionally stable. All of these things were still incapable of actually predicting whether or not parents were going to be neglectful. By their own characterization from both first proposition and second proposition, these parents are likely going to be, for example, playing video games instead of taking care of their children. I think it was something that it could never actually be predictive, but if they really wanted to be so predictive at the end of the day, this again diverted away more resources. A lot of individuals, and if they want to say they're so irrational as possible, all of their actions could never actually be predicted. All of them are going to act accordingly to their certain circumstances right at the very get-go. And therefore, on opposition, we win on all the metrics and we take on the actual burden within this debate.
Thank you for the speech. Now the floor goes to the last speaker, the reply speaker from a proposition.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think that the opposition stance is not to actually protect children. We think that actually on their side of the house, looking from their own arguments, they are saying that parents having the right to be able to give birth to children is the most important thing. Therefore, we think that actually we do not have some kind of consented result or consented implication that we have in this debate. Therefore, firstly, to clarify this debate, we on our side of the house, we are protecting the children, the most vulnerable people that we already said in our principal arguments, and furthermore our second speakers too. And on their side of the house, they're trying to protect the parents. Therefore, first of all, we win because we are protecting the children, the most vulnerable ones. And second of all, we think that even if their parents feel some kind of obligation, if that doesn't lead to any action for the children, it is actually really harmful for them. Therefore, very proud to propose 2 classes in my speech. First class about parents, second class about children. So first class about parents. On their side of the house, they say that because of some kind of biological connection, many parents feel the obligation in the first place. Therefore, these kind of things are not really necessary. However, 2 things I want to point out. First of all is that all parents feel obligation. This is not always true. This is because of 2 reasons. Firstly, in looking at the reality, there are actually a lot of child abuse in the status quo, and furthermore, there are also some child labor. These kind of things are resulted because parents do not feel the obligation. For example, you don't always have to focus on children. You don't always have to take time and work for their own children, and furthermore love them. And furthermore, they also think that actually child labor is okay because these kind of children are your own possession. However, on our side of the house, we will be able to prevent these kind of things because this kind of test will check whether these kind of parents have these kind of ideas and so on. Therefore, because before we will be able to test these kind of children and these kind of parents, and will be able to say that you don't have any right to give birth to the children, we will be able to prevent this. Second reason is that these kind of things are actually long term. Therefore, many people are not really able to actually imagine the difficulties and also the hard effort that they always have to go through when they have to raise some kind of child. Therefore, being that actually feeling obligation is not always true. But even if we take it in the best case, we don't think that these kind of parents, we don't think that we will be able to take their argument. This is because even if we have the obligation, if we don't have the capacity to be able to put it into actual action, we will never be able to make the child really happy. This is because of things, for example, financial capacity, emotional capacity, and so on. Being these kind of things are really important because in the capitalist society, buying things is really essential. However, some of them are really costly. Maybe you won't be able to afford for this kind of food, clothes, and so on. Therefore, those kind of things lead to lack of having things, senses, good daily goods, and so on, leading to the unhappiness of these kind of children. Therefore, first of all, in the parents' cash, we take this cash. Second cash about the children. They said that they will be able to provide really good social welfare. However, first of all, let's kick out this thing. This is because it was really unclear about what kind of welfare they actually have, what kind of social welfare these kind of children will actually be able to have. Furthermore, we do not know whether these kind of parents who actually do child abuse, who actually do this kind of child labor, actually have the incentive to take this kind of social welfare from the government in the first place. Therefore, we cannot just say that there is some kind of social welfare, therefore it is okay on their side of the house. Furthermore, it is actually non-sustainable rather than not sustainable. This is because as our two speakers have clearly rebutted that we have to provide food close to these kind of people. Those kind of things take a lot of money, while on our side of the house, testing using AI and so on is actually much more affordable. Therefore, being that on our side of the house, you'll be able to provide better parenting for these kind of children because of the capacity of this model. Therefore, we win this debate. Thank you.